So in order to move to the vision that you laid out, where all the transaction of the food supply chain is completely transparent, what kind of organisation, what kind of role does AgriLedger need to play? Do you propose to be the kind of central record that everyone trusts to manage that record, or are you just developing something for somebody else to take on that role?
No, it's so I probably didn't say much around the project in Haiti. It's actually being sponsored by the World Bank. So there is a role for those kind of organizations to play. Unfortunately, I think that at this time they still are thinking in a very centralized, governmental, heavy way of enacting. But I think that there is almost sort of like a UN point of view. I can be the one which is, so if we develop standards, I can be the one which is working with the smallholder farmers or small companies who don't have the money to go pay for £2,000 a day of IBM consulting, and that can come to me and I can help them translate their vision into a system. And the more people we have using the system, the more it becomes trusted. And as such, it gives also us as a customer the ability to trust the information that is coming through. So maybe I'm not thinking big enough for myself, but I think there is a role that we can play in that, and leading that way and saying it is possible to happen. And it's around really creating the standards, and it's getting all of us to agree to the standards.
But it's interesting that you think that there's perhaps a non-commercial role. There needs to be some kind of governmental role
No, my role is commercial.
No, but you mentioned that it may be the UN, for example, who are the...
Oh, it could be that actually everybody, remember that's the beauty of the blockchain. The DAO was a failure because the DAO was based on financial gains. This now, what I see is those standards can actually be driven by the users of the system, and this is, you create the consensus. This is the beauty of blockchain, it's consensus models. So if you create consensus model, then people will push the direction that is necessary. The same way I believe right now, we don't have enough data that's available, but as people start realizing, if I expose this data, I'll enrich my ability to do better or do more. And then there is more available. So I think we will self-govern in this way.
Yeah, someone always wants to know what the next guy over is doing, don't they? How's that farmer growing? How's he doing? But if there was a better way of sharing that data and learning from each other, you can both benefit. It's this rising tide effect. And exactly what you're saying, it's the governance model. It's about the governance emerging from the people who are taking part in the system, not some overarching body that's imposing it from the top down.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the things I'm most curious about, and this was my question earlier, is that I can see once everybody trusts in the system and has adopted the system, and everyone is mutually aware of what each other are doing, then right, you have that kind of mutual governance. But how do you get to that stage? The project needs to have
I'm actually doing it in a way which is a bit unconventional and conventional. So Haiti, with all that mess, is still, you're pushing that. I am also going to work with the credit unions who usually create mutuals. So what we need to do, I don't talk about removing middlemen. I rehabilitate people into their roles. You have roles and responsibilities, so using very much a RACI model. So government is actually in the I and little c. But if you get people to that, then they start self-governing and they start thinking about how to improve their own lives. So ideally, it's about understanding the best decision. As individuals, that's what we look for. So I believe that what I'm doing is moving the bar toward that, versus some of the solutions right now are very much siloed. So that's why I've also designed the system to where it doesn't care what the commodity is. What it cares is what is the process that needs to be followed, and then it is a digital twinning of that asset and that asset, how it moves. So in the Haiti contest with the World Bank, they wanted us to have ownership retained. I believe there are other models to where we do, because I don't believe in contract farming. Contract farming is a risk mitigating process, but now if you can move the risk to where the risk is even across, where the farmer understands, I don't give a good product, I'm not gonna get a good price, then he clearly has that ability. And what we also do is we're working with financial institutions to then shift the risk of the financing from the farmer to the person who's bought it. So I've delivered goods to you which are of perfect, and I can prove it, and I can give you a whole history of where it came. Now you've agreed, you've bought it, you owe me, you owe the farmer. So either pay today, might give you a discount, or I'm going to take it and I'm going to take it to a factory. So that factoring is not against the farmer, it's against the supermarket who's bought it. They have the balance sheet, which means we now can start looking. I don't know if you know, the fresh fruit market is about 45% per annum in terms of financing. We can bring that down to about 12 to 24%. You could actually cut it through half. And through the blockchain, and this is why I was talking about collaboration, I can pass the data over to someone, and then it's their accountability to make sure my farmers are paid very quickly.
Great. Claire, your work at Producers Direct, you work with coffee producers around the world to give them support in various ways. What are the, from your understanding of their challenges, to what extent do they map with the challenges Genevieve is talking about in terms of the access to finance and the trust in the supply chains that chime with your experience with it?
Yes, definitely. So just as way as an introduction, so Producers Direct, we work with a network of about 1 million smallholder farmers internationally across coffee and tea, but also food crops as well. And our experiences are very, very consistent. I think the key to all of this is that a lot of people are thinking about and designing for the challenges that farmers are facing, but not necessarily thinking about engaging those farmers themselves as experts in that design process and starting from their realities. So for example, the farmers that we're working with, they're struggling with access to finance, they're struggling with market access and capturing the fair value for their prices across both currently structured supply chains like coffee and tea, but also unstructured supply chains. They're also struggling with data and the management of records. Everyone who works with smallholder farmers is looking to extract data from them. That might be for commercial reasons on traceability and transparency. It might also be from a non-profit point of view to demonstrate the amazing impact we're having on the lives of smallholder farmers. So everyone is collecting data from smallholder farmers. Nobody is thinking about how those smallholder farmers can actually be empowered to manage their own data and have ownership right at the base of the supply chain in order to take leadership from there. And so there are so many challenges where technology and digital solutions, including blockchain, but not necessarily only blockchain, can have a massive impact. But ultimately, a lot of them are falling short currently because actually, in the design process, that leadership isn't coming from the smallholder farmers. Often people design the solution and then pass it on. For example, we were talking earlier about, okay, it's fine, a smallholder farmer can use this system on an app. But if they don't necessarily understand the purpose of the system or how they can use it to get maximum value day to day, short term, immediately for them, then ultimately it's secondary for them in terms of priorities.
I understand you haven't deployed blockchain as part of the offerings, but you've thought about it. So what do you see as the potential role or the extent to which it might be relevant for the people that you support?
Okay, without giving away too many exciting details from my pitch later, no, I think there's a massive opportunity about the data and the digital identity. I think the point that I was making earlier, there's so much data that people are acquiring about smallholders' impact and traceability, and yet, for example, some of the farmers that we work with, the most innovative entrepreneurial farmers, so many different people want data for them, and so organisations, including Producers Direct, will go and they will go and interview a farmer for about an hour to fill out this really long survey about how much the activities that we've done have improved their livelihoods. All of that data is collected and we collect it. Possibly another NGO doing similar work will turn up the next week and do exactly the same thing. Possibly somebody looking to check that there's a fair trade certification compliance will also go and speak to that farmer. Rainforest Alliance might come in the next week, and then others like supermarkets who have their own systems. Increasingly, we're seeing people wanting their own traceability systems, will then go in and collect that data. Nobody is sharing data. No one shares that data back with the farmers. Nobody who are supporting farmers coordinates with each other. And at the farm level and at the cooperative level, where there's a key point of aggregation for these smallholder farmers, there's a huge opportunity to actually standardise and have that data in formats where it's owned by the farmers, as we were talking about earlier, but also that the key parts can be shared with different actors without necessarily giving away the sovereignty of that data. So I see a massive opportunity there. And then building on that, then how can you use that data profile? So, for example, women smallholders currently completely marginalised from a lot of products and services and financial services particularly, primarily because there's very little data on the crops that they're growing. So, for example, typically across developing countries, the cash crops would be primarily managed by men. There might be data records on the cash crops. The women would be managing the food crops. No data on them, and often women aren't allowed to own land. So how do you document and evidence assets for these women smallholders who, incidentally, are 50% of the smallholders growing our food? And so there's a massive opportunity to use the data and the transaction history to then be able to link these women and to actually empower and have better access for them to financial services and other services that currently they're being marginalised from because they don't necessarily have the right data or asset register in order to demonstrate their entrepreneurship.
Great, thank you. Coming a little bit closer to home for a moment, Rob, the Digital Catapult looked at the UK's kind of blockchain DLT sector last year. You found a sort of handful of companies that are focused on the agricultural sector. Do you think it's an area where there's particular potential for the UK's technology sector and the UK's agricultural sector? Or does that make sense, that there's a bit of work to be done, but not huge?
Yeah, so in fact, both of these stories are exactly what we're very interested in driving forward as a sort of a neutral organisation here, is proving out the technology, proving that this has a place in the world of agriculture, and also improving models around enabling farmers to take part in these systems. We are engaged in a project that I can't quite announce just yet. But once everything's signed and delivered, we'll be able to talk about it. But that's quite exciting. Food tech is, agricultural sector, supply chains are a major part of the UK economy, and it's one of the strings to our bow. What we're looking at: aerospace, manufacturing, heavy industry, food, agriculture. So, on the point of who's out there doing this. We've recollected numbers this year. It looks like there's still around 300 or so UK-based blockchain companies or UK-registered blockchain companies. Interestingly, it looks like there was a massive contraction. About a third of last year's survey died off, but then about another 100 have grown. So we're just in the interview phase at the moment, figuring out what's been going on with everyone out there and what their current issues are, what they're facing. So I don't have the numbers on the top of my head of who's in agriculture versus other sectors, but the market's been through a bit of a churn, probably as a result of the ICO craze and all that last year.
We've also talked about the production side, the supply side of it a lot. Do you see, what moves have you seen, if any, from the demand side, and I suppose I mean from retailers, to be sponsoring and leading these kind of projects?
It's a difficult one for me to answer personally. It's best to talk to someone on our biz dev team who actually speaks to the supermarkets and so forth. As I understand it, it's the same shape as many other market sectors that we work with. Lots of POCs or investigatory work, little on the way of actually sitting around the table with people they need to collaborate with and actually discussing common infrastructure. So our 3 supermarkets, let's now start using this common system between us.
Same question for you, Genevieve. What have you seen? You mentioned the sort of Walmart example, but generally speaking,
so
what is the role of retailers?
So we have in the UK Prominence, which has been doing quite a bit of work, but that's more toward. It's great work. I mean, I love what Jesse is doing, but a lot of it is more around the marketing that the individual which is selling. So that's that aspect. You also have Ripe.io, which is coming out, which is looking, but again, Ripe.io is going after the market, which is held by Walmart, the Walmart IBM. This is where they're focusing. But the other piece that we didn't talk about here, which is the commodities, the commoditization of the information, and this is where I think there is going to be opportunity, therefore, to then bring in better, we all talk about liquidity. But one of the challenges around coffee, cocoa, yes, they're wanted commodities, but they take time, or even wheat. There is that cycle. How do you get through that cycle, but create a mechanism for those farmers to actually be able to have a life? What I think that you're going to be able to do with the blockchain is, because you know what's coming down the pipe, or you know what came from that pipe, what exactly it is, you then have a better view to then be able to have better futures and better markets.
Yes, and London, of course, being one of the global's financial centre, one of the world's financial centres, it's the majority of blockchain activity here is fintech, and it would be nice to have a kind word from the regulator on what sorts of activities shall be permitted, in light of Libra coin facing these massive issues in the States. For what is essentially, okay, I don't want to particularly dwell on Libra, but what looks very much like a shared bank account with 30 signatories is somehow going to destroy the world's banking system.
What's the parallel to the food system?
Cooperatives, so the money exists within the system, and whoever needs it can take it out, and when they sell, they return funds to the system.
There's also other ways, which is a colorization or underwriting of the assets, and basically you don't expose all the assets. This is something that is done currently already in regular markets. So you expose part of the book. You allow for investment that creates liquidity, which then can be fed into the system. And then when the goods, instead of selling the goods, you're selling the performance. That's the stock market as it is. But now you have data that backs up the information. One of the big challenges is, like, let's say if there's a flood somewhere in the world, it takes days to find out months to find out what actually was lost. Most of the futures is based on what the USAID said was done last year, and sometimes it might be 2 or 3 years ago. So you really do not understand.
This goes to one of your other points that I thought was very interesting. It's something that we're interested in as well, is the IoT element, the actual in situ sensing element, and how you gather data from the ground, not human entered, but say local weather stations, local networks of flood monitoring, feed those into your models and so forth.
I got a better one for you. We're working with ESA. You don't need to put a bunch of IoT. The Sentinel-3, which went up in April, can measure the water table contents. It can also measure the bacteria. There's a bacteria that grows in food that they can measure from space. So you're looking at about an 80% accuracy. And
measure bacteria from space.
Yeah, they can measure the content. Yeah, so the information is actually being brought back to where you can see the activity of the bacteria and then report on it and then make what is necessary, which means you don't need to stick something in the ground. You don't need, so you then have that validation against what's happening in the weather station. So we did an abstract last month around that. It was in September, we presented it. And the idea is that you could then use that data with the blockchain data to give evidence to the traders, so that the future traders understand what are the outcome are going to be, but also for the farmers, letting them know how much water they need to use, what is the water content, what is the table, what is the nutrients.
Well, it hits on your other point about carbon footprint. If you can create better risk models and better manage these elements, maybe I'll pick a couple of days early so I'm not stuck in traffic because there's going to be flooding down there, or all these elements do feed into a more holistic system, a more integrated.
While we were talking about the IoT, I was going to ask Claire about, because one of the services you provide for your producers is their ability to monitor their own farms, and I understand that is reliant to a degree on some kind of IoT devices. So what experience have you got in managing that infrastructure of devices, presumably literally in the mud, in some of the most remote places in the world? That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, but a lot of what we do can be a nightmare.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think, no, I agree. I think as much as possible, it would be good to get away from specific hardware devices at the ground level. I think where we're using them at the moment is to ground truth. So, for example, we've been testing kind of how climate predictions that you can derive from sort of the large-scale forecasting can then actually be ground truth with sort of weather insights from these weather stations to see whether actually what the predictions are at a larger scale is consistent with what is happening at the farm level. But I think then you then have the additional challenge of actually how do you ensure that the people who are receiving this data then know what to do with it? So for example, with floods or for early warning systems, you know, you're not only looking at how actually that data is getting to the person, but then making sure that once they have that data, they know what to do with it. And so, you know, on the experience of managing the nightmares of weather stations in mud, I think it's definitely a big issue. And I think, again, it goes back to making sure that the people who are responsible for the weather stations, so in this case, smallholder farmers that we're working with in Kenya and Uganda, they understand the value of that weather station for them. And so therefore they feel not only responsible for it, but they're also understanding the immediate value to them. And that involves them not only being able to access the data in formats that they can understand. So that's not going to be a smartphone. It might be a dumb phone. It might be, for example, a warning by text message, or it might be a paper-based set of information about how their farm is performing based on the weather. But ultimately, you know, it's that peer-to-peer accountability and making sure that the other farmers who are also seeing this weather station and wondering why one farmer has this very expensive piece of equipment on their farm and whether or not they want a piece of that too, having a system whereby everyone's understanding the value of that, not only for the farmer that owns it, but also the community, and therefore jointly feels responsible for taking care of it as well. So, but yeah, I agree, IoT installations are definitely not going to solve the world's problems.
There's another phrase that's been around the world of blockchain for a while, which is permissionless innovation. And this is, it speaks very much to your point, where if you have the infrastructure and the systems there, the person installing those systems and infrastructure don't have to dictate how they're used or the presentation of data back to the farmer. Someone local can say, you know what, I've got a great idea on how to present this data to the farmer. And that is new economic activity, it's growth, it's education, it's all the stuff that we want to see from these systems.
Yeah, and so I mean, and that's essentially what we do. So we don't necessarily focus on technology design. We work with farmers groups to understand and help them design actually how they're going to have that data feedback and design the systems that they're collecting and using the data. Again, so that it's in formats that they understand, and therefore they feel like they're the leaders in this that then we can build from.
So this is actually in line with what CTA, so in June I was in Agra for the African Green Revolution, and the findings is that you do need to have what we're calling extension workers, which are people who are translators and whisperers. That's the role I played in technology for many years. When I worked in the bank, I was the person between the business and the technology and explaining how do we move it forward, and that's how you get innovation. And as you mentioned, you want them to then create those new economic model from there. Also, blockchain does not mean a smartphone. It does not need a smartphone. All you need, it does make work for you because now you have to translate the message that comes in, but M-Pesa works without a smartphone. So we need to get away from that view, and also we need to assure that connectivity doesn't happen all the time. We have the same problem here, but through that use, eventually, and also we need to stop giving. We need to, because when you give to somebody, they don't see the value, and sometimes even you can't explain to them the value to them, so you make them earn it. So my point of view in Haiti is once they want that smartphone, they will buy that smartphone, and they will force the data services to be provided to them on a regular basis by the companies who want to make money off of them. So it's creating that empowerment in a different way.
So I'd like to move a bit back to the demand side again. We hear a lot about how, as consumers, we're all becoming more environmentally aware and environmentally concerned, socially aware. And I'm sure most of us would be fascinated to know more about the provenance of the food that we're eating. Meanwhile, we hear a lot about that solutions are available that could make that possible. But it doesn't seem to be happening. That the consumer demand, such as it is, doesn't seem to be translating into transparency in the supermarket. So why not? And what can we do as consumers to make it happen?
Because the reality, I think, is that we believe the supermarket is making a lot of money. The supermarket is making a lot of loss, and through those loss making, those prices go up. As customers at the end, we may want to be socially conscious, but we are more financially conscious also. So if you go in and there's 2 apples and one is £1 and the other one is £5, you can start thinking, what does my pocket looks like? I don't care if you tell me that £5 comes from Timbuktu, but if I am going to spend that £5 is when I want to do it. Where I think there are opportunities, which is where government, this is why I like working with the government, is really about food safety. So the issue becomes not so much exposing the customer, but making sure that the customer is protected. Did that fish really, like the tuna, did it really come from where it says? And did it always have maintained temperature which was needed? Because if you get sick from it, it's really going to hurt. And when we look at the statistic from FAO that about 400,000 people die every year from food poisoning, and those are children, but 40% of them children under 2. Think about the human toll that we have actually lost to that. So, and this is where those systems will start bringing the trust. Obviously, there are a lot of traceability system going up. The fundamental issue I have with them is because it's my data, and also we all know that if it's my data, I can choose to not give it to you or let you see that information. The centralized system, it's not the top of the company who's going to make the change. It's the guy in the middle who's really scared that he's going to lose his job.
Yeah, we're at the beginning of a gentle revolution from competitive, centralized models to sort of, what's it called, cooperative. Yeah.
Yes.
Co-opetition, exactly, where companies can carve out their domains, but they share data and infrastructure to gain mutual benefit from it. And it is a transition in thinking, it's a transition in practice. The business models haven't yet been developed that will allow multiple parties to benefit from these types of environments, and that's maybe something you're facing as well, is well, you know, if someone's putting in the infrastructure, how do you pay for it to be maintained? How do you pay for it to grow or be modified in the future? These are, you know, this type of decentralized thinking has only been, with the available technology that is, has only been 10 years old. So I'd still say it's early days yet.
Okay, I've got one last question. I'm going to open it up to Q&A very shortly. But so the food that we actually eat has obviously been transformed and shaped by technology over the years, whether it's actual agricultural technology, what can be produced, or transport, what can be brought to us. So what do you think, if your vision, for example, is realised, how is that going to change what we eat?
We're going to be more sure that what we eat is what it says it's going to be, and that the person who has actually done it for us has been fairly compensated. I mean, I don't want to sound crunchy, as they say with that, but a farmer, you know, there's a big problem. Globally, the farmer's average age is about 56, 58 years old. How do you get the youth to actually participate? Well, you need to make it to where it is profitable for them, to where they don't think this is going to be subsistence work. So that's where, for us, we have to think about how do we push that back, and it's that de-risking of the process and making sure that the profits are coming down.
Yeah, I think just to build on that point, I mean, you know, I also, you know, the stats on within our network, our average age of farmers is over 60, and it's critical that the next generation really see farming as viable. So if not, the question is not how it transforms the food we eat, but actually whether we'll have enough food to eat, you know, by 2030, actually, with a growing population and growing food demands. If we don't fix this problem of production and food wastage, the issue will be, do we have enough?
It's about a fairer economy, isn't it? That's essentially what it's about.
And that's what you have the possibility with blockchain. I can retain value, I can understand what has been spent, everybody can, there's nothing wrong with if you give the best service to be paid 10 times from somebody else, but you have to prove that you have given the best service. And what I think there is, for me, an opportunity is moving farming very much toward an Uber or Airbnb model to where the ownership or of the asset is retained much longer, which means much more participation in the financial benefits.
Great. So do we have any questions in the audience? There's one right here. We'll have one microphone to circulate, so if you wouldn't mind your patience, it's on its way.
In terms of the co-petition side of things, I understand that the energy sector, through Jojo Hubbard, when I spoke to her 18 months or so ago, that she was able to manage and to get that solution put in place. How much cross-sector, when we're all trying to solve similar problems but in different sectors, is going on in terms of being able to say, okay, you've managed to find a solution, how can we bring it into our market?
I think it's embryonic right now. On the energy sector issue, it's actually regulatory that's inhibiting it. As I understand it from speaking to some energy providers, peer-to-peer trading is not currently allowed. Peer-to-peer trading of energy.
It's the suppliers that she's managed to get to work together.
I mean, we have the national grid. I mean, that was if you look at the history of electricity, it was private providers supplying local areas, and then eventually we said, hold on, we need to build some national infrastructure. And it's that infrastructure layer that the distributed ledger and distributed systems are all about.
So one of the things that is actually, you're getting a lot of interest. And when you look at, let's say, the transportation, so you've got there's 2 or 3 consortiums going on around that. Tradelands, and there is also, there's 3 going on. But one of the big issues around shipping is there's not enough reefers, and reefers are the coal containers. There's not enough of them going around the world, and being able to track where they are and where they've been used, and if they have actually been planned properly is something. So that is creating that those companies are starting to say, hey, maybe we need to start to look at it. Now, obviously, you would prefer that they look at moving toward a distributed ledger because you don't want to become a consortium to then there is this cartel that gets created. So these are the opportunities, and it's obviously not only about shipping, it's air, it's road, and if there are any delays, you want to be able to tell, because if not, you're standing. Also the issues around planning are things that they want to deal with because it's costing them money. So there is a ripe opportunity. Now, unfortunately, the ICO sometimes makes that they wonder, oh, are you going to tokenize me, and how am I going to make the money, and things like that, and it really stops the conversation. So there are good consortiums going up, and it's about getting them to continue, as I say.
Yeah, I think it's the data first, get people comfortable with being in a common environment, sharing data, sharing process, and then talk about the financialization after.
Yes.
Because the financial stuff is still, the regulations are murky, uncertain, people are scared, people are excited. That needs to settle a little bit before you can move into that world.
Okay. Any other questions? There's one back here.
Thank you. Hugh Huff-Thompson from MindHub. Are any of you talking or working with any of the majors in the agri-space? There's the ABCD consortium as well. You mentioned Comgo and others, but ABCD is Bunga, Cargill, Dreyfus, Glencore, and there's 2 others now joined. Are you working with those guys?
No.
And sorry, tied to that question, can you get enough momentum working with the small players to change the industry, or do you need those companies to join?
So if you look at the history of Amazon, Amazon won by aggregating the long tail. It ignored the major players, went after everyone else, giving them a voice, giving them a marketplace.
Any more questions?
Mr. Nick Davies.
It's me, yes. Yeah, you probably guess what I'm going to say. I don't want to plug the government side of things here, but I would just be interested. I think there probably is a role for government here, not as a heavy-handed regulator or as a sort of, nor indeed as a procurer of this technology as yet, because I'm not absolutely sure we know enough about it to be able to do that safely. But I think there is a role for us as a bringer together, a brigader of those ecosystems on which it depends. And if you throw in the sort of regulatory and fiscal burdens that we place on people from HMRC, from the Food Standards Agency, from DEFRA, HSE, and so on, I think that's how we can do things. Because in my experience, Barclays, for example, have done, and HSBC have done some experiments, a bit like that which you are doing, Genevieve, but they haven't found themselves capable of both establishing and maintaining the ecosystems that are required. I think there's a role for a benign state to actually help with that, not as a major
Sorry,
intervention.
Please. Yeah.
I said you were part of the small C in the I for this.
Thank you.
I agree. Just a bit of gentle permission. So we would like to see these sorts of experiments take place, or we would like to see these sorts of things form, but please don't play with these ones yet. That's the sort of thing that could come from the centre, drive activity, drive innovation, make people want to come to the UK because it's now a permitted innovative activity, and we will all learn from it and benefit from it.
So actually one of the things that we're grappling with is the legal context of the digitization, because what we're going to be doing is you're taking an asset and you're transferring it cross borders. You're creating basically an obligation, and that obligation is being tracked through. So one of the challenges, so we were told, put smart contract, and then we went, stop, those are not smart contracts. Because the definition of a smart contract is I'm passing one value to you. This is, you are being measured, and if you don't meet those measurements, then there is going to be consequences. Or the process is being measured, and if all toll gates are met, then you go to the next section. And those are really legal contexts which have not been touched. The other big thing is most agricultural policies are so old, and they favor the big players. They do not look at how to protect the individual. So in the same way, so I live in Jersey. Jersey had to change the laws because you couldn't do Uber, you couldn't do Airbnb because you couldn't. The rules said how you define the living there. And I think that it is it's imperative for government to start looking at that. So Haiti is not a fly-by-night. They've been doing it for 6 years, so they've already looked at their e-signature, their e-digitization to be able to move that. And I think the UK government needs to look at that context in the agricultural. And the UK issue is big. Farmers in the UK are looking for capital, and they don't know how to get that capital. And then you have the Barclays wondering how to get that capital to them, because there is that lack of trust between the two parties. So there is an opportunity there, and having government come in and say, we will indemnify this process as you test it, will also help.
I think just one extra point to add on to that, the effectiveness of development aid and the data and impact tracking that is done on that. I think for the UK and multiple governments, there's countless service providers from the commercial and non-profit sector collecting huge amounts of data and reporting on and being accountable to the use of those funds. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to standardise those systems, to have people collaborate more effectively on the collection and the use of the data, and also to enable a lot more transparency and traceability on what is and isn't working in that space.
Is Alice doing that? I think Alice SI.
So Alice is an interesting one, aren't they? They're a startup that's looking at charitable giving.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very nice idea.
I'm going to get in the way of lunch with one final question. You mentioned the development context there, and Genevieve, you mentioned the fact that 70% of our food comes from developing countries. So what's at stake here? Do you think that reforming the food supply chain, whether it's through blockchain or otherwise, does that have the potential to change the kind of economic fortunes of entire countries?
Yes. I think that if we can get, this is really the green revolution that Africa is doing. And if you look, actually, the inverse is already happening, where you have large organizations of the world, a large country. So a lot of land has been bought in Kenya by China, and they are farming it to bring back the food to China. So you are having where the West is going into those fertile lands and co-opting those areas, and but pushing the native out. And that is going to create more unrest if we don't do something about it. And so for me, it's not about, okay, let's just make the small guy better, but we have to do it, or you're going to continue to have those riots. Do you know in Haiti, those guys are not saying, I want to beat you up. They say, I'd like to get a job, please. So how do you create that so you stop having those issues is key.
Do you want to answer that, or should we leave it on that sobering message?
Yeah,
Great.
I just completely
Great.
agree. Yeah.
Let's leave it there. Great, thank you very much. Please do that.